Um, thank you everyone. Noswaith dda pawb. Good evening, everybody. And diolch am dod heno. Thank you for coming this evening. It's great to see so many people. Welcome to my presentation on the monasteries of Mid Wales. My name is Reynolds, and as Mel has pointed out, I'm a PhD researcher at Bangor University. I'm undertaking a research project on the role of the monasteries in Mid Wales and the impact they had on medieval Welsh society, culture and religious expression. The borderlands of Wales and the Marches in the Middle Ages provide a unique cultural and political region in which to study the role of an international monastic order such as the Cistercians. The Cistercians were the most successful monastic order in Wales. By 1201, there was an abbey of white monks in every major Welsh polity, and they held swathes of agricultural land throughout Wales, gifted to, or in some cases sold to, the monks by secular landholders. The monasteries and their communities played an integral part in the infrastructure of medieval Wales. They were administrators and diplomats on behalf of the Welsh rulers. They became guardians of Welsh literature, producing some of the most important medieval Welsh texts. The buildings themselves became an integrated part of the historic landscape, and several abbeys became dynastic mausoleums for the ruling houses of Wales. So what exactly do I mean by Mid Wales? Well, for the purposes of my research, and therefore this presentation, I'm talking about the strip of East Wales that ran from the northeast through central Wales to just north of the Brecon Beacons. This broadly equates to modern day Powys and parts of Denbighshire. In the medieval period, roughly up to the 1300s, this was the cantrefs of Powys Fadog, Powys Wenwenwen, including the regions of Aristli and Cadwain, and Rhwngwya Hafren, which included the cantrefs of Elfil and Meilianydd. What is particularly interesting about this region of Wales was its independence, both from the Anglo-Norman marches, but also from the ambitions of the rulers of Deheubarth and Gwynedd. That is not to underestimate the role of alliances between polities, but even under overlordship, these regions still managed to retain a specific cultural identity, an identity forged from adapting to external pressures. The Cistercians, masters in adaptation themselves, integrated themselves into these localities, as they did in other parts of Wales and throughout wider Latin Christendom. The complicated patchwork of politics also makes this region an interesting case study. So within this geographical boundary lies 4 Cistercian houses, 3 male communities at Cwmhir, Strathmocella and Vallecrucis, and 1 female house at Llanlligan. For the purposes of this paper, I'll be focusing mainly on the male houses. As I've argued elsewhere, the female monastic experience in Wales filled a different niche to that of the men. So if I were to integrate Llanlligan into the political role of the male houses, it would present quite an unbalanced argument that would disregard the female communities as inferior, which simply just isn't true. They're just merely different. I've entitled my presentation today, "A Refuge for Welshmen to Fly Unto," after a comment made by the 13th century chronicler Matthew Paris in his description of a monastic site near Montgomery. Paris was a monk in St. Albans between 1220 and 1259. He was a well-connected man and compiled a chronicle of early 13th century England, the Chronica Miura. This chronicle was composed from an English viewpoint to reference to skirmishes in central Wales between Llywelyn ap Iorwerth of Gwynedd and King Henry III. Paris describes how in 1228, a place belonging to the Cistercian order was burnt by royal troops because it was considered a refuge for Welshmen to fly unto. The event occurred in the context of conflict between Welsh and English troops in the march. For the same year, Paris mentions how the castle of Montgomery was under siege by Welsh forces before the garrison were relieved by Henry's army, presumably causing the Welsh troops to retreat into the nearby Kerry Valley. Matthew Paris identified this monastic site as a place called Crydia, which was translated by the Chronicle's editors in the 19th century as Kerry. Well, there was no Cistercian abbey in the area of Kerry, but the Abbey of Cumhir did have a grange called Gwernigo, which was situated just west of Sarn towards Kerry and following along the Kerry Ridge. You can see it on the map on my slide here. It's number 34 with the bigger circle. The site described by Paris, therefore, was more likely Cumhir's Grange, and Paris's comment suggests that the area was considered a place for Welsh troops to retreat to. Henry's decision to destroy Gwernigo, while political in nature, nevertheless would have impacted on the agricultural and economic outputs of the monks at Cumhir. Paris's simple reference to this one event sums up the tightrope of allegiance that Cistercian houses along the borderland had to walk. The Welsh March in the 12th and 13th centuries was a complicated jigsaw of cultural and political exchange. For the Cistercians in Mid Wales, conflict, alliance, and changing polities directly impacted the monastic communities. So the aim of this paper this evening is to explore the ways in which the monasteries in Mid Wales impacted on and were impacted by changing political dynamics in Wales and the March. Previous scholarship has tended to focus on the secular motivation for monastic patronage. So what did the rulers of Wales gain from founding and patronising monastic establishments? Well, I don't intend to offer any radical reinterpretation of the arguments made by the likes of historians such as David Stevenson, F.G. Cowley, or David Williams. Instead, I propose alternative ways of approaching the primary material. I'm looking in depth at the diplomatic of the charter evidence, so that's the formulaic wording and the format that medieval charters tend to follow, and exploring monastic material culture, the surviving art and architecture of monastic buildings. I'm doing this in order to demonstrate the role of monastic communities themselves in maintaining relations with the local rulers. So what was the motivation and agendas of the monks themselves? I hope that this approach will contribute a new viewpoints to the topic of Welsh patronage, giving us a fuller picture of the complex symbiotic relationship between ruler and monastery. In his article for the journal Archaeologia Cambrensis, Hugh Price highlighted the importance of understanding the charter evidence as, quote, only one stage in a process of negotiations between benefactor and monastery. The surviving charters are a snapshot in a process of negotiations and often adhere to a formulaic wording and diplomatic. But the charter evidence as a surviving written record is also a material representation of an ongoing relationship between grantor and order, reflecting the involvement of both parties. The voice that we find in the charters may represent the perspective of the secular grantors. Certain clauses and diplomatic reflect the aspects of patronage important to the monastic community, notwithstanding that the charters themselves were composed by monastic scribes and retained by the community. Furthermore, monastic personnel frequently appear as witnesses and the abbeys as places of issue, highlighting further the involvement of the monastic community in the granting of charters. It's worth pointing out that there are no surviving cartularies for a Welsh monastery. There survive, quote, probably no more than 500 charters to Cistercian houses in 12th and 13th century Wales, compared with about 5,000 for Fountains Abbey before 1300 in Yorkshire, or almost 2,300 for Burgundy before 1200. The scarcity of charters is further complicated by the scattered distribution. The 350 charters relating to Margam Abbey in South Wales vastly outnumber any other Welsh Cistercian house, with the nearest comparison being about 70 texts relating to Strata Marcella. So any analysis of the charter evidence in Wales has to take these limitations into account, and it makes any direct comparison within and outside of Wales problematic. However, close analysis of the surviving charters does give us an insight into the motivation of the monasteries when it came to patronage. So the initial foundation and the earliest charters relating to Strata Marcella, Cumhir and Valley Crucis illustrate the role of the monastic communities in the spread of the Cistercian order. These early grants also show how the development of Welsh polities in the 12th century impacted the spread of monasticism. The first mid-Welsh house to be founded was Strata Marcella in 1170 by Owain Cyfeiliog, ruler of southern Powys. Owain's foundation of Strata Marcella can definitely be viewed in the context of state making. The grant of the initial foundation lands to the abbey occurs during a period of political consolidation. The granting of the abbey lands formed part of Owain's emergence of authority in Powys after a period of uncertainty following the death of Madog ap Meredydd, ruler of Powys in 1160. The political turmoil in Powys between 1160 and 1170 pitted Owain Cyfeiliog against his rival, in particular his cousin Owain Vychan, who held land in the Commot of Mechan. With the assistance of Henry II, Owain Cyfeiliog held a precarious authority over most of Powys by 1170. Now, suggestions for the motivation of Owain in founding Strata Marcella are multi-layered. It's been suggested that the foundation was a thanks offering for his newly established authority in Powys, or that the foundation of a Cistercian abbey was a symbolic attack on the class church of Maivods, the traditional recipient of Powys patronage, but which lay in Owain Vychan's lands in Mechan. It's also been suggested that Owain Cyfeiliog's role as the founder of a Cistercian house in Powys placed him as the Lord Rhys's rival as a patron of the White Monks, and may have influenced Rhys's assault on Owain in 1171. The spread of the Cistercians in native Wales really kick-started with Rhys's patronage of Whitland and Strata Florida. Before that, the Cistercians were exclusively patronised by Anglo-Norman martial lords. Now, what these suggestions fail to take into consideration is the role of the Cistercian order themselves in the foundation of a new monastery. In his charter, Owain, quote, has granted and given to the brothers of the Cistercian order, namely of the Church of Whitland, the land of Strat Magel, to build an abbey to God and in honour of the ever Virgin Mary. It's worth pointing out that the charter demonstrates that the name Strata Marcella was already an established place name in Powys at the time of foundation, which means that the abbey took its name from the place, embedding the monastery in the locality, and not vice versa. While some of this wording is typical diplomatic, it's also noteworthy as the naming of Whitland as the supervisory house of Strata Marcella. What's interesting about this is the relationship between Whitland and Lord Rhys. Rhys took over the patronage of Whitland along with Strata Florida in 1165. If, as has been suggested, Owain Cyfeiliog was founding Strata Marcella as a rival to Rhys's patronage, why then choose a mother house with close relations to the ruling house of the Deheubarth? Owain had already demonstrated his alliance with England and the Marches, so why not choose a Cistercian house from the Marches, such as Basingstoke or Combermere? Historians can, with hindsight, highlight the significance of the Whitland affiliation in Wales. All the Welsh abbeys could claim descent from the Abbey of Whitland, but Whitland had yet to establish an abbey in native Wales beyond Strata Florida. Owain had no precedent on which to follow. Given the hostility between Owain and Rhys, Owain's decision of founding an abbey from Whitland suggests the involvement of the Cistercian order themselves. It suggests that the community in Whitland wanted to extend their influence into native Wales. Another example of the involvement of the Welsh monastic communities in establishing new abbeys in Wales, it can be seen in the foundation of Valley Crwcus by Madog ap Cyrydydd Maelor of North Powys in 1201. Madog, quote, moved by charity with an appetite for non-transient praise, has given and granted to the monks of Strat Macel, the Ville called Llanagwestel, to construct a monastery, that a convent of the Cistercian order may continually serve God there. He has given this at the request of the 4 abbots, Peter, abbot of Whitland, Daniel of Strat Fleur, Philip, abbot of Strat Mahel, and Reynolds of Cumhir. He has given these lands to God and the Blessed Mary and the monks of the Cistercian order at Valley Crwcus. Monastic personnel also appear in the witness list to Madog's charter. Philip, abbot of Polla, which is Welsh Pool, Strata Marcella, Philip, abbot of Valley Crwcus, a monk identified as Hugh, 2 other monks, and a conversus. The gift of grants to God and Mary are, again, usual wording for charters, with the added recipient of the grant being the monks of Strata Marcella, the mother house of Valicrucis, again reflecting the involvement of a mother house in the foundation of a daughter community. Madog's opening section of the charter also specifies that the Cistercians as the monastic order of choice to receive this grant. But the further involvement of the Cistercian order in Madog's grant is reflected in what Madog states as his motivation for gifting the grant. According to the Foundation Charter, Madog was approached by 4 Welsh Cistercian abbots to establish a Cistercian monastery in his polity: Peter of Whitland, Daniel of Strata Florida, Philip of Strata Marcella, and Rhydyd of Cwmhir. At the turn of the 13th century, Powys Madog was the only major Welsh polity to not have a significant Cistercian abbey. The invitation of the Cistercian abbots to Madog to establish an abbey in his lands was a clear indication on behalf of the Cistercian order to establish a monastery in each Welsh polity. Monastic personnel appear in the witness list of Madog's charter, but what is interesting about this witness list is it already identifies the abbot of the community that is being founded. It suggests that the community of Valicrucis already had an established hierarchy at the time of the abbey's foundation grant in 1201, and that the mechanisms for the establishment of the monastery were well underway before the order had even received the Charter of Foundation. So there survives no foundation charter for Cwmhir, issued by Cadwallon ab Madog, ruler of Meilienydd in 1174. Cadwallon's initial grant survives only in later confirmations, though there survive charters to Cwmhir from members of Cadwallon's kin group. Again, with the foundation of Cwmhir, we can see the impact of Lord Rhys's patronage of Whitland and Strata Florida. Cwmhir was founded as a daughter house of Whitland at a time when Cadwallon was in alliance with Rhys. This is evident in Cadwallon's appearance with Rhys in 1176, when the two rulers paid homage to King Henry II. It suggests that Cadwallon was following Rhys's example by founding and patronising a community of Cistercian monks in Meilienydd. On the other side of the political coin, there survives an early and important grant to Cwmhir from the March and Mortimer family, dating to around 1200. Roger Mortimer's grant to Cwmhir confirmed extensive land in Meilienydd that had been gained by the Mortimer family through conquest. Confirmations of this kind, granted following the conquest of an area by a new lord or as part of a political alliance, were common and functioned on multiple levels. For the new lord, it was an opportunity to consolidate their new territory. Confirming land implies the authority to alienate that land in the first place, and it creates a tie between the new ruler and the locality in the form of monastic patronage to the local abbey. For the monastic community, it guaranteed the continued support of the local ruler and ensured agricultural output on their granges could be sustained. Similar to the Welsh grants, Mortimer's grant follows a specific diplomatic, where the grantor gifts the land for the salvation of their soul and those of their family. Mortimer's grant has an added spiritual element. Roger specifies in the grant that it was also being made for the salvation of his men that died in the conquest of Meilienydd. With this added line, Mortimer's grant embeds the abbey, not with the Welsh lordship of Meilienydd, but with the men who fought to conquer it. Similar to the grants made by Owain Cyfeiliog and Madog ap Grefydd, Roger Mortimer used monastic personnel as witnesses to the charter. However, these witnesses were not Welsh nor Cistercian, rather the abbot and prior of the Augustinian house of Wigmore in Herefordshire, which was another recipient of Mortimer patronage. Now, Cwmhir had a very complicated pattern of patronage. It received grants from the native houses of Meilienydd and Elfil, as well as grants from South Powys and Deheubarth, but it also received important confirmations and grants from the Mortimer family and various kings of England. War in the Marches in the mid-1200s impacted Cwmhir more than any other Mid-Welsh abbey, as well as the burning of Gwernygo, men of Montgomery damaged Cumhere's woods in Kerry in 1252, and another of Cumhere's granges was burnt by royal troops in 1231, after allegations that a monk from the abbey was involved in an ambush of English troops, though Matthew Paris states that Henry III's mercy extended far enough to spare the abbey itself. The foundation of Marcella, Refuge, and Cumhere demonstrate the multi-layered mechanisms for patronising a monastic site and the factors that motivated both local rulers and the monastic communities. The charter evidence can also give us an insight into the extent that Welsh houses were patronised by Anglo-Norman lords, and that Anglo-Norman monasteries were patronised by Welsh rulers. The traditional narrative of the Cistercians in Wales from scholars has argued that the Cistercians were so successful in Wales because of their natural affinity to the landscape and their close relationship with the local Welsh elites. To an extent, this is true. The Cistercians were the most successful order in Wales. The sheep rearing agriculture fitted the Cistercian economy. Cistercian personnel appear as diplomats and administrators for the Welsh elites, and several Cistercian houses became the dynastic mausoleums for the ruling houses of Powys, Gwynedd, and Deheubarth. The Cistercians were part of an international order, but their relationship with the local elites and their importance in the infrastructure of Welsh politics and society reflects a remarkable ability on the behalf of the white monks to create a dual identity, to be part of a wider European network, while also to be embedded into their locality. Now, this traditional narrative, though truthful in some ways, does disregard the fluidity of the Welsh marches. Patronage, like other aspects of medieval culture, crossed the divide between native Welsh and Anglo-Norman. Patrons to the Marcher House of Basingstoke Abbey include rulers from Gwynedd and Penllyn. The Shropshire House of Howmond received patronage from Powys, Gwynedd, and Aristley, and Combermere was patronised by the rulers of North Powys. Conversely, Strata Marcella received patronage from Anglo-Norman patrons, including King John and the Marcher Corbett family. Valley Crucis received a confirmation from the Fitzwarrens of Whittington, and Cumhere was patronised by the English throne and the Mortimer family. So you can see in the table that I've got on my slide here, some of the charters that were issued to Strata Marcella, Valley Crucis, and Cumhere. So out of the total of 90 charters for Strata Marcella, 77 were from Welsh patrons, but 13 of them were from Anglo-Norman patrons. It's worth pointing out, you might have noticed that the total number of charters from Strata Marcella vastly outnumbers that of Valley Crucis or Cumhere, is rather disproportionate. Fortunately, most of the Strata Marcella charters have survived at the Winstay records of the National Library of Wales and have since been edited and translated by Graham Thomas, I think in 1999, and published. So we do have a lot more charters relating to Strata Marcella than we do for some of the other Welsh monasteries. What's noteworthy about looking at the Welsh and Anglo-Norman patrons is that if we disregard this patronage, we run the risk of portraying a Wales that was more insular than the evidence suggests. It also underestimates the Cistercian order's remarkable ability to adapt to their locality. In securing Welsh and Anglo-Norman patronage, the order was allowed an opportunity to secure their grants, ensuring the continued success of the order despite changing politics. This is a very pragmatic approach, and it demonstrates that the Cistercians integrated themselves into Wales, but still made a point to protect the order's interests. Interpreting this juxtaposition contributes to our understanding of the Cistercians as a whole. It highlights the order's adaptability in Wales, as can be demonstrated in other parts of Europe. It also highlights the nature of medieval Welsh culture as being open to wider European influences, rather than focusing entirely on an insular, nationalistic view of Welsh history. So finally, what's the significance of exploring the impact of Welsh politics, the development of Welsh polities, and the role of both Anglo-Norman and Welsh patrons in the success of the Cistercian order in Wales. The current narrative for heritage organisations interpreting monastic sites in Wales is one of presenting straight evidence without providing much interpretation. Many visitors to these heritage sites do not have the knowledge of medieval Welsh culture and society to fully appreciate the cultural significance of the monasteries in Wales. While more recent scholarship has tried to highlight this significance, it's still reserved mainly for an academic audience and is yet to trickle down to public history. Perhaps a way to reinterpret this would be to put the history of the Cistercian order within the Welsh experience to highlight the significance of the monasteries in medieval Wales. I hope the research that I've presented today has highlighted some new approaches to monastic studies in Wales and has hopefully explored some different ways of interpreting monasticism. The eventual aim of this research is to demonstrate the role of a popular international order such as the Cistercians in the development of medieval Wales. The dual identity of the Cistercians as belonging both to Wales and to an international order reflects the order's capability to adapt to their locality, not just in Wales, but we see the same thing happening in places like Yorkshire, Ireland, the Low Countries, as well as France and Spain. While the readiness of the rulers of Wales to patronise the popular Europe-wide monastic order highlights how contemporary and connected medieval Wales really was. As I mentioned before I started my talk, the research I've presented today is very much an ongoing project. This is research that I've been undertaking the past year. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I'm not as far ahead in the research as I would like to be. So I hope that what I've said today has made some kind of sense. But it is exciting that we're still able to reinterpret the role of the white monks in Wales. And I do look forward to further conclusions. As it's still very ongoing work, I would really welcome any feedback, either in the questions when I finish, or if you prefer, you can email me at Bangor on hip81e@bangor.ac.uk, which is up on the slide as well. In the meantime, thanks for joining me this evening, and I hope you all enjoyed my paper. Diolch yn fawr.